Good Tuesday to you, everybody in ComGov 603. Welcome to week boom 4. How is everybody doing? It's tea this afternoon. I know it looks coffee-esque, but it's not. Chai tea to be specific, which is redundant really, because in the place of the world from which tea originated, the word for tea is chai. However, I digress. Okay, welcome. As some of you pointed out, I did not have a video last week. That was not wholly unintended. It being a short week, and the readings for week 3 again focus on very, very straightforward terminology. So, as a reminder, as part of your, what you're doing in this class, and part of what you'll be held accountable for, say, on the midterm exam, wink, you'll need to be able to define and distinguish the difference between things like mean and median and mode and standard error and standard deviation. This is just the jargon that goes with empirical research, and you need to learn. It's like learning Spanish, okay? You just need to know how to say, whatever. Pencil, lapis, I think it is. Spanish speakers out there, correct me if I'm wrong. Okay. So likewise, you need to be able to understand those terms. You need to understand and be able to describe what's a variable, right? I mean, I'll give you the short answer. A variable is basically any event, whether it's the accumulation of things or the effect of something that you want to measure. And specifically, as we're going to find out in week 4, okay, what we're really after in the empirical process is trying to determine as to whether or not there is causation. Right now, this for week 4. This is for this week. The important point, the thing to really focus on, is being able to distinguish between correlation and causation. This is the pivot around which empirical research turns, and it doesn't matter if you're talking about quantitative or qualitative research, which we'll get into later on in the semester, okay? So for this week, what's the difference between the two? Well, correlation, this put quite simply by way of definition for these two terms. Correlation is when two things are happening at the same time or in close sequence, and it seems as if they're related because of the proximity to one another, but they may not be related. Causation is when two things are happening simultaneously or in proximity or in sequence, and the one thing is making the other thing happen, hence the term causation. Okay? So for instance, you could take a look, you could study the number of ice cream cones sold on the beaches of West Florida, that is the Gulf side, and start from the first month of the year, January, February, March, April, May, June, July, August, September, October, November, December, back around again. And you'll note that the number of ice cream cones, or let's just say ice cream. I mean, why limit it to the cone? Ice cream sold, the amount of ice cream sold goes up as we approach certain months in the year. March is one where the ice cream sales go up. And then June, July, and August are another period in which the ice cream sales go up. Simultaneously, you could then count how many shark attacks there are on the west side, that is the Gulf side. And I use that side specifically because a lot of bull sharks on the Gulf side, and they're temperamental and very aggressive as fish. And start in December, January, February, March, etc. And you might notice an increase in a certain month like March and an increase in certain months like June, July, and August. What would you conclude? See, that's a correlation. These two things are happening in parallel or the one's going up and the other one's going up, would you conclude that people who eat ice cream are attracted to sharks? No. You should rightly conclude that when it gets warm or when it's spring break, like March, there are more people on the coast, and more people means more ice cream sold. And when it's warm, because that's the people are there, more people on the coast means more people in the water, and more people in the water means a higher likelihood of shark attack. That's a correlation. Okay, the two are not necessarily connected. Now, they might be. It doesn't mean that when you see two things happening at once, that there's no connection, all right? But you want to distinguish between correlation and causation. And the old expression is correlation does not equal causation. Causation is when the one thing going on causes the other thing. So back to the coast of Florida, okay? You might study the incidence of people wearing jewelry. I just have a watch, but let's say like a shiny bracelet or an ankle bracelet, and the occurrence of barracuda attack. Okay. Well, you could ask, we know from people that catch barracudas that they use shiny, jingly lures. And so when someone's out in the water with something on their wrist and it's going chiki, 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 flashy, 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 their odds of being bitten by a fish like a barracuda go up. That's causation. The shiny jewelry is leading to the barracuda thinking this is something to eat, but it's not. It's someone's wrist. All right. So for this week, week 4, make sure that you know the difference. Okay. Let's talk a little bit about week 3. That is what you did last week. I gave you a video to watch, Dr. Jordan Peterson. Now, if you don't know anything about him, where is the book that I really wanted? I'm not seeing it right away, of course, because I probably loaned it out to somebody. He is, by my account, probably one of the preeminent minds of our age. And he's got a couple of works that are well worth your time. Okay. The one that perhaps he's become most famous for is the 12 Rules for Life, which is not a bad book. Right? It's a lot of communication, sociology, political science, and psychology wrapped into one. And then he did a follow-up, another 12 rules, because the first one's called An Antidote to Chaos, and then the other one is An Antidote to Tyranny, to Order. Because he was making the case. We have systems and behaviors in place to keep the level of chaos in society down. But the flip side to that, the downside, so to speak, is that when you're not allowing change and innovation within society, then you get to stagnation. And if you have, status quo just for status quo, like we're going to do it this way just because this is how we do it. Well, now you have North Korea, all right? And you don't have innovation, and you don't have development, and you don't have change. So he wrote the 12 Rules for Life book. The book that I think is more worthy of your time and investment is called Maps of Meaning. And in it, Peterson takes a sort of a grand, 5,000 feet, like way up there view of cross-cultural and cross-chronological, that is, in different places in the world and in different times in the world, an examination of why it is that we construct the structures that we do, everything from the stories that we tell ourselves about ourselves to make sense of ourselves, to the systems that result, whether it's religion and politics, relations between the genders, and so on and so forth. And he finds, and he demonstrates that there are common threads, there are common themes across time and across cultures. And he's asking the question, okay, why these meanings? Why do we assign, why do cultures in completely different places and at completely different times assign similar meanings to the interpretation of events and the structure of reality? And he asks some hard questions, including the questions about the existence of a created entity. Commonly the word that's commonly used to refer to that is God. And I'm betting, yeah, I've lent my copy out, and that's why I'm not seeing it on my shelf, so I could have it, just shake it here in front of you, which makes it more real or something. I don't know. That's a good book. I've read Maps of Meaning probably 3 or 4 times. And every time that I go through it, and I've had it, it's been out for years. Every time I go through it, I pick out something new. I'm like, oh, hey, wow. Okay. That's Jordan Peterson. I gave you a little clip from one of his lectures. He's been recording his lectures for years, in which he talks about the Pareto distribution. Okay. And what I want you to do in looking at that, watching that video, is ask some hard questions. All right, and namely, if what he's saying is true. And by the way, the Pareto gets its name from the Italian economist who stumbled upon the phenomenon. Okay. If this mathematical rule of distribution holds true, how might it affect the ways we think about solutions for political and economic problems like poverty and economic advancement? Okay, and I'm poking at you a little bit. I want you to roll this around in your mind. All right, that's why I gave it to you. Okay, so let's take a look at some of your answers, and I really want to focus in on this video and this phenomenon, and see what you said. Okay, Jennifer, and I think here's a misspelling, but you had Pareto, but it's Pareto. Distributions concept that those who have everything more will be given, and those who have nothing will be taken. Okay, this is called and he uses this as the Matthew principle. That's not exactly it. All right, it's a law of distribution that when people exchange things, there's a certain distribution that results. Okay, and that's called the Pareto curve. Mr. Peterson goes on to explain that production is measured and social. Anything you can assign monetary value, you can be measured. With this being understood, I believe that the way to go about teaching people economically is wrong. I think many people know this concept a few ways, but have found ways to shame others into certain teachings on finance. What's interesting is the same people who have an understanding of this convert with shame people for being poor. For example, my neighbor gives me her extra milk because she doesn't want it to spoil. At first, I was annoyed. I didn't understand what she was doing until one day I forgot milk at the store. 20 minutes later, after all my groceries were put away, she knocks on the door with the milk. I literally felt the wealth of the Israelites in the desert with Moses at that moment. Okay. All right. Interesting response, Jennifer. Okay. That, and I pick it now. Look, and when I pick people out, and I will periodically throughout the semester, I'm not picking on anybody. Okay. I'm picking out answers that do get at what I want you to take away from something, or don't get at it quite as well. Okay. So Alana, let's take a look at your answer. All right. So Jennifer, that's not quite what we're getting at here. The Pareto distribution is a power law probability distribution, commonly called the 80-20 rule. It's named after the Italian economist, sociologist who used it to describe scientific, geophysical, and social phenomenon, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, we're going to skip the definition because we know this. Most of the world's citizens are bundled into low wealth categories, and a small percentage occupy high wealth categories. Distribution versus normal distribution contributes to suboptimal policy decisions and conditions worldwide. For social, political, and economic perspective, numerous methods exist to analyze income inequality. One common use approach involves sorting countries' income by ascending order and dividing it into intervals. Okay. Critical political and social solutions include instituting better policies on proper education, subjects, and standards with clear guidance on what is and what is not acceptable, serious legislation against predatory student loan companies and student loans together, as well as significant investment in programs, courses, internships, prepared individuals, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. All right. Now we're getting a little bit closer to what I want you to get from this. And that is that this curve is, it's a, well, it's a mathematical law. What do we mean by that? We mean that you see not an exact replication of this curve, but you see a repeated approximation of this curve when you look at distribution of it doesn't matter what. Okay, and when we say this curve, what are we referring to? I'm going to get out my handy pad, as I sometimes do. Okay, so here's our axes. Okay, X and Y. Okay, and here's the amount of whatever we're talking about, and here is the time of exchange. Okay, when we look at exchange, and this again, it doesn't matter if it's ideas, if it's money, if it's food, we tend to find a distribution that develops and looks something like this. Okay, it does not look something like the inverse, where it's like that. So over here, okay, we have the number of things. Let's say it's, the classic example of this, to explain it to American audiences, is let's say that you took 1,000 people and you gave them each 10 $1 bills, and you put them in an auditorium, and you said to them, okay, here's a game we're going to play, and it only has one rule. You can exchange any amount of your $10 bills with anybody else, okay? And you can exchange them for any reason whatsoever. Just like, hey, here, want $1? Or hey, if I give you one, will you give me two? That's it. Okay. Anything you like. Okay. But the only rule is that you must engage in exchange. Okay. That's the only rule. Now, why is that the only rule? Because within systems, whether it's political or ideas or economic, people are always engaging in exchange. Now, yes, there are some people out on the margins who exchange less than others, but there is no one who exchanges nothing. And that becomes self-evident, because if you have someone within a system who exchanges nothing, they exchange no ideas, they exchange no currency or no Tinder, legal Tinder, not Tinder, tender, it's, different. Okay, so they're not like swapping chickens for bread or whatever. They're out. They're not in the system, and they don't factor into how the curve comes out. Okay, so then you say, go. One of the things that tends to happen, repeated over and over, is that about 10 to 20% of the people in the room end up with about 80% of the dollars. That's these guys over here, as the time goes on. And the majority of people end up with, about 80% of the people end up with about 20% of the dollars. Now, the puzzling question, that this occurs as a mathematical phenomenon is not in dispute. The puzzling question is why does the distribution sort out the way that it does? What is it that determines the difference between the 20% that has 80 and the 80% that has 20? And for policymakers, or for you individually, the question becomes, first, let's start with you individually. Okay, how do I get myself into that group of 20 that has 80? And how do I stay out of that group of 80 that has 20? And then for policymakers, the question becomes, what do we do with that 80%? Now I can give you clues because no one, there's a lot that's been written on this, and the full deep dive is beyond the scope of what we're doing here. But to the first question, there are a couple, sort of a handful of characteristics. Again, back to our experiment with people with handfuls of $10 bills in the auditorium. There are a couple of characteristics that are shared among the 20% that end up with 80% of the stuff. Number one, they make exchanges. That is, they're engaged in the exchange. So they're not sitting on their $10. So first of all, by way of policy, this idea that the rich sort of pile up money that they then, I don't know what, stuff in the mattress or bury under the ground is an economic myth. All right, those that accumulate wealth through the movement of, through the process of exchange, in this case, in the auditorium. Okay. Another characteristic of those that end up in the 20% as opposed to the 80% is they have the capacity to resist the impulse of instant gratification. They are more cautious. They're more measured in how it is they exchange their dollars with others. They ask a lot of questions about themselves, first and foremost. Do I need this? Am I distinguishing between I want this and I need this? What are the longer term ramifications, of this exchange? So whatever that is, whether that happens to be purchasing a vehicle, renting or buying a home, all of these things. That's the other characteristic that tends to mark out those that end up in the 20%. They have a capacity for delayed gratification. That is, I've got to get it now because I'm feeling this way and I need to have it. They develop this capacity to separate the activity from the emotion. Okay. So take that with, in terms of how you operate with, whatever, what's the word I'm looking for? Whatever fluency you like. Okay. Whatever applicability, how you will or won't apply it to yourselves. Okay. And then finally, for week 3, it's kind of a giveaway question. Why should we be interested in statistics? According to the select readings from Smith. Okay. Well, the short answer is because statistics is us. It's about us. That's why. Okay. So for week 4, for this week, all right, we're going to focus on the distinction between correlation and causation. We're going to do that in some interesting ways, I hope. I'm going to have you read an article that asks the question, why did Van Gogh cut off his ear? In other words, what led up to this event? And the takeaway that, it's an interesting article, but, you may need to study it a little bit. But the takeaway from the article in toto, in aggregate, that is the big takeaway, is when it comes to human behavior, we should be very cautious about assigning singular causation to the outcome of events, because humans are in how we behave are very complex, in part because, number one, we do not always, in fact, most of the time, we do not demonstrate the effects of other variables. Things are affecting us. We're not making this known to researchers. And in many instances, we're not even making this known to ourselves. That is, there are people, maybe you know some of them now, that you meet that just don't seem to spend much time thinking about thinking. And that's not a criticism. That's a behavioral pattern. That is that, things are coming in and they're having reactions, but they're not thinking about, okay, well, why did I do that? All right. And so trying to diagnose human behavior and boil it down to a single causation in the research field and in political science is problematic, right? But this goes to the heart of the difficulties in distinguishing causation, which is the main focus of the empiricist. What makes this happen? Okay. All right, everybody. Keep working on your papers. Remember, read that instructional sheet. You're not going to be required to do the research project. This is if you were given a big fat research grant, what would you do? But you have to lay out with enough clarity the thing that you're going to work on, the methodology with which you're going to work it, the data that you're going to gather, and then what you would do with that data, and then some of the impediments to the whole process. You have to lay that out with enough clarity that someone would say, oh, this is brilliant. Here's a brick of money, right? That's your objective for this paper. All right. And part one is going to give you some opportunity to get some feedback from me. All right. So that due date is coming up here later in September. Okay, everybody. Have a great rest of the week, right? Work on your papers. Enjoy the reflections on Van Gogh and his ear, and I will see you on Canvas. Okay, take care. Bye-bye.